Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. My guest this month is Matt Marble. Taken from his website, Matt Marble is an artist, author, audio producer, and director of the American Museum of Paramusicology. Both creatively and through historical research, his work explores the inspired intersections of art and metaphysics and the intuitive disciplines they mutually employ. Matt is the author of Buddhist Bubblegum, Esotericism in the Creative Process of Arthur Russell, and host of Secret Sound, a podcast exploring the metaphysical biopics of American musicians, and The Hidden Present, an audio interview series exploring intuitive discipline and spiritual imagination. Additional works have been featured by the California Festival, Warp Records, and the Philosophical Research Society. His writing, research, media production, and personal archive constitute the American Museum of Paramusicology, or AMP, through which he also publishes the monthly AMP Journal. The term paramusicology was first coined in 1993 by author Melvyn Willin to address psychic and pagan histories of music. Musicology being the study of music, paramusicology is the study of paranormal music experience. Though the term has struggled to find solid footing, the paranormal generally refers us to that which is beyond or outside the normal, to experiences or phenomena which cannot be explained by scientific reasoning, objective perception, or causal agency. This points our awareness to what may be called the numinous in human experience. Due to its abstract nature, to even convey the numinous requires active imagination and symbolic communication. The AMP explores how the numinous informs human listening, and it unpacks the esoteric philosophies and intuitive disciplines which facilitate and draw from our spiritual and auditory imagination. In this discussion, Matt shares a bit about his background, as well as his inspiration for creating his platform. He talks about his visual art project known as Wandering Stars, a mixture of music and physical visual works, and how this came out of his dream work. He also talks about his podcast, The Secret Sound, and his 7-part series called The Hidden Present, and we even go into a short discussion about musical modes as used in Western music, thanks to my brother Dan for making that distinction, and their moods, as well as how these can be useful tools for creativity. We then move to talk about the AMP Journal and focus on issue 16 from last August called Spirit Invocations. In this issue, Matt wrote about the film Longlegs and how song is key to this film, including the role of folk music and rock and roll, as well as the esoteric aspects of these, along with how Mark Bolan served as inspiration and perhaps as blueprint of sorts for the main character. He also discusses the concept of the faux-out, taken from the Theosophical Society, and how this may have inspired the ideas behind the metal balls that Longlegs placed inside the doll heads in the film. We talk about this and much more. In short, this is an introduction to the wonderful work that Matt is doing, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thank you for having me. Wonderful to be here.
It is a pleasure to speak with you today. We are acquainted with each other on Instagram. At least I follow your page there. It's the first time that we actually are talking today in person, but, not in person. I guess you could say as much in person as we could be in person.
Yeah.
Although I am rather ashamed to admit that I hadn't really delved into your work and subscribed to your website until very recently. And I'm trying to make up for that now. Mea culpa. I'm really enjoying everything that I'm taking in right now.
Thank you.
I really mean that. What you're doing is amazing, amazing work. I'm not just trying to butter you up here. I really mean it.
I appreciate that.
So, before we get into all of the work that you have been doing and are still doing, I'd like to ask if you'd share a bit about your own background and what led you to do the work that you're doing now.
Well, I was raised in Mississippi by an Episcopalian priest, bishop, father who prioritized social justice issues in his ministry. So I often say I kind of walked away from the church rather than ran away because I could not argue with that aspect of things. My mother was a social worker and a psychologist who was deeply inspired by Jungian psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, and she kind of fostered that inner world for me at a young age, and the social justice values and that inner work kind of always have gone together. Also a nice dose of psychedelia in my adolescence, and tons of art, music and painting and poetry. But at a certain point, because I'm so intuitive, a lot of what I was doing was based in experimental work and improvisation. So I was curious to know more about what we know about sound and listening. So I got a bachelor's degree in speech and hearing science, realized I did not want to be a scientist, and kind of reinvested back into the arts, and then pursued a PhD at Princeton in music composition. And that's where I did a dissertation on Arthur Russell and the role of Vajrayana Buddhism in his creative practice. And that kind of I was always interested in mystical philosophy. The Cloud of Unknowing was a huge influence in high school. Simone Weil was a big influence to me. But it was really studying the Buddhism, the literature, and doing some kind of basic meditation practice that opened me up to New Age occult metaphysics and those traditions that I had kept at arm's length for the first half of my life. So that brought me to a deeper understanding and respect for those traditions. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, I had kind of a life falling apart scenario unfurl, and was saved really by a dream that woke me up. I used that dream work, I reinvested myself in the dream work and applying it to art in a way that helped me overcome some addictions. And I made a vow at that time to dedicate myself to this work. And so that was about 5 years ago. And it's all I've done ever since.
Right, yeah. So you had been working with your platform for a while before the pandemic, then I imagine, correct? Okay.
So I did the dissertation, and that, again, I said that opened up some doors for me. And I basically started looking back in time at that point. I was like, what is it about Arthur Russell that so inspires me?
Okay.
And it was finding a lineage, an American lineage that I could identify with that was not based in style or reaction against style like experimental avant-garde tradition tends to be. It comes back to what I call the 4 I's, and this can almost sound like a cliche, but inspiration, intuition, imagination, and insight. These things that we generally do not talk about in music school.
Right.
And that's like what I wanted to focus on completely. And I found metaphysics to be a very practical language and a reservoir of methodologies to hone intuition, essentially.
I love it. Yes. And it's also quite accessible because everybody has these abilities to a certain extent, So you can really connect with people on these different levels of the 4 I's.
Right.
So, yeah.
Especially artists.
Yeah, exactly. So my second question was, of course, you obviously, looking through your journal articles and listening to your podcast episodes, you have a lot of insight into esoteric and occult topics. And I was wondering if you had any, quote unquote, formal education in the field of esotericism. And if I kind of getting from what you've just said, I'm getting the impression that you didn't really have any, formal training, academic training. So I'm kind of wondering, where did you learn about all of these topics?
Yes, no formal training. I mean, I've done a workshop here or there, and I do have a long line of Freemasonry I discovered in my father's side of the family.
Okay.
But I've never been initiated. I've never been done any formal study. I really kind of point to my dreams. They have seriously indicated a lot of things to me. And then during the pandemic, I did the study of Buddhism, the literary study of Buddhism with some adjacent meditation practice. but then a really deep pandemic study of Jakob Burma's writings and Howard Thurman and Carl Jung's kind of approach to alchemy and dream work. Those influences, I would say, kind of gave me what I perceive to be a grounded perspective on metaphysics in a way that I was able to start to be able to connect dots across traditions, and fell in love with kind of a comparative perspective and just still haven't gotten enough.
Right. Well, you do it very well. I mean, it's super engaging.
Well, thank you.
The way that you go about making those connections. I've really been enjoying delving into all of your work. As I said, my first contact with you was through Instagram and through your page there, the American Museum of Paramusicology, or AMP. Mm-hmm. What led you to create this platform? Because apparently this has been going on longer than 5 years, correct?
Yeah, the AMP started about 2 years ago, and that was I just decided that I was doing too many different things. Too many projects were sprouting.
Yeah, okay.
And I needed psychologically and kind of organizationally an umbrella for everything.
Okay.
So that really encompasses the research, the archival collection, the physical archives that I've been kind of slowly collecting, as well as the different media sharing, whether that's podcasts or essays or books. So that was my attempt to kind of establish an umbrella and kind of a larger foundation for everything. But that, it emerged out of the Secret Sound podcast, and that emerged out of a series of really indulgently long essays that I wrote. And so it was, after kind of collecting enough biographies, metaphysical biographies, which is really the focus of my work, is how people apply these metaphysical philosophies in their creative process and art, but also in how it impacts their lives. It was through that and kind of going through these different traditions that people have been inspired by that I've kind of the whole has been kind of forming of its own accord. I haven't guided this very rationally, and I prefer it that way.
Sometimes it's better to let that creative side just unfold and not put too much directive energy on top of that, trying to direct something. Sometimes it just unfolds on its own in a very natural and beautiful way. I mean, that's the impression that I get when I'm reading your work and listening to your podcast episodes. It's just, for me, I'm going to tell you this. I was kicking myself. I'm like, why didn't you listen to this stuff sooner? Because this is exactly what you love, as you love things about music, you love esotericism. Why, this is right up my alley. So
it's always there for anyone who's ready.
I guess I just wasn't ready until recently. So I guess that's just what it is. But I just, sometimes I feel like, darn it, I would really have enjoyed this a lot earlier than just now. Anyway, okay, I'm going to stop beating up on myself.
Yeah, don't do that.
So anyway, but as I said, you have a treasure trove of information on your website, and it's not going to be possible for us to talk about everything today, but I'd like to ask you about your visual art project called Wandering Stars. Mm-hmm. You wrote that this came out of the pandemic and that it was basically a life-saving endeavor for you. And I was wondering if you could talk more about what inspired this quite extensive project, because it's not just art, it's music. Mm-hmm. And you also talked about how your dreams played a huge role in all of this. I was wondering if you could just, kind of expand a little bit on that.
I mean, this kind of came out of that life-saving dream that I mentioned.
Right, yeah.
And then a series of dreams where I was using dreams to develop a divination practice, a personal divination practice. Oh, okay. I love divinatory traditions, and I've researched a lot of composers who have applied those in their work, whether it's John Cage and the I Ching, Arthur Russell, even some of his work takes on this divinatory quality of kind of generating melodies out of this magma of correspondences. And my home language is geometry. Since I was a child, I think before I even spoke, I was, drawing nested geometries. And in the early 2000s in Portland, I was directing these kind of community music ensembles using social geometry, where I would arrange people in space and geometric figures. And so this is something that's just stayed with me throughout my life. And as I was embracing more metaphysical traditions and exploring divinatory traditions. I found myself really put off by the anthropomorphic imagery. I needed something more simple and more abstract for me personally. And I found through this kind of network of geometric figures, I was able to embed dream symbolism and other aspects that I could work with, whether it's color or music, musical pitch, in a very subjective, creative way. And that's where the Wandering Star exhibition came out of. I also had a dream where I was living in an exhibition space and I was looking at a painting on the wall, and I made that painting happen. And I made the exhibition happen based on that dream. And a lot of it came together in the process of actually I would literally was just started bringing objects from my home into the exhibition space and kind of putting things together intuitively from there. But I was drawing with alcohol markers in part, kind of a symbolic contrary to alcoholic addiction that I was dealing with prior to that.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So there was lots of like transmutation going on.
Yeah, I was making some notes as I was watching the video that's on your website that talks about this exhibition, and I made notes of organic, geometric, but spiders, snakes, and butterflies, because you had an installation where you were using, I guess, like caterpillar in like you had an old guitar that you had transformed, and you had like little caterpillars and butterflies, and I think you had a snake head on the fret or something like that of the guitar. So I thought, yeah, there's something going on here that's not just. It's, of course, what you're doing, of course, is you're working with geometry and shape and form, but there's another layer here if you're thinking about insects and, snakes. I mean, snakes are already, so snakes and butterflies, and, they're very symbolic. So were these also things that you were finding in your dreams, that these were coming up again and again for you?
Dreams and serendipitous encounters. Okay. Like the butterfly came from my mother, who has a tiny collection of butterflies and moth wings. And I just had an image one day and I said it out loud. And she was like, well, I have a butterfly right here that you can use. Yeah. And so that's how that happened. But most of the animal and insect imagery I draw from comes from dreams. And these are like a very specific set of dreams that... one thing that kind of connects them, which is really interesting to me, is they generally displayed to me very unusual ways of communicating or transducing information. For example, the spider dream is one I come back to a lot, and that the original dream, which was probably happened 20 years ago now, this was a spider communicating to me through vibrations in its legs that I felt through vibrations in my rib cage. And I had a series of dreams with animals and insects where these different styles of communication were happening. And so that's something that I translate into texture a lot of times, that flickering of the fingers.
Yeah.
So I do that with the guitar. Whenever you hear that texture, there's probably a dream spider in my mind.
Okay. Yeah, I find this really interesting because the way you were just describing, your love of geometry and of putting people into forms and things. I thought, have you ever thought about being a choreographer? I mean, you would be perfect at something like that, I think. I don't know if it's ever crossed your mind, but that's what it kind of,
I've veered into like theatrical ideas or some choreographed ideas, but the closest I've come is that social geometry, arranging people in space.
Well, who knows? Yeah. You might go into choreography. Who knows? You never know what will happen. Maybe you'll start dreaming about working with dancers or something.
I would love that.
Anyway, you have the listeners can find it on the website, but you have a square where you drew tiny squares within the larger square, and they all have particular symbols. Some have triangles, circles, squares, that are all different combinations of these shapes. And they also have different colors. And you made a large square with these tiny little squares within it, and then you have the symbol within each of those tiny squares. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about what was behind all of that. Because you mentioned about the title of the exhibition was the Wandering Star, but that these symbols kept coming back for you, and that you were creating these symbols. What was the significance of that for you?
Well, this kind of chart of squares these are the wandering stars, what I call the wandering stars.
Oh, okay. All right.
So there's 81 of them. And that image came from a dream in which it was particularly 81. I saw the grid in my mind and wrote it down. But that's something I was looking for a way. I needed a discipline for this kind of dream work that I was doing. And this was one way I found to do that. So each of these squares has 3 dreams embedded in it, 3 of 9 that I work with. And so they're just in different permutations. So I kind of numerologically, I'll choose a square to meditate on or to reflect on. And that'll have me sit with 3 of these dreams that I like to return to, not to interpret for any kind of fixed outcome, but to re-engage in an enigmatic manner. So this was just a way for me to organize these things and have them be more kind of add some synchronistic element of engagement over time that I could come back to, and it'd be different every time. And I was talking with someone else about this recently, and there are times when I felt kind of crazy when I was developing it, not knowing what I was really doing. But every time I invested myself in it, I just found just this well of inspiration. And that's what I've allowed to guide me. If the inspiration is flowing, then something is going right. So I just keep following.
Right. I put in the notes that I sent to you that these emblems that you made, they reminded me of the film by Kenneth Anger, Lucifer Rising, when the magus he puts on this elaborate robe, but it has these types of triangles and circles and squares on in the pattern on the robe, and also Gustav Klimt's painting that's known as The Woman in Gold, where she also has this very long robe that has all of these circles and triangles and squares on it in different patterns. And you also see it on one of the figures in the Tree of Life as well. And I didn't know if if either one of those things had any resonance with you. Are you familiar with Kenneth Anger films? Are you familiar with Klimt's work? And do you see a resemblance there as well, or is that just my own interpretation?
I think that's kind of like minds enjoying the same interface, so to speak. I'm not like deeply familiar with either of their work, but obviously I'm familiar and admire both of them. One thing that led me to work this way was I was looking for the simplest possible tools and visual as far as visual goes. And that led me to a circle, triangle, and square, which to me kind of, represent all kinds of Trinitarian or triadic things, principles, and so forth. And I've arranged these in such a way that I can kind of extract the 4 elements from them as well and work with them in different ways. But because of the simplicity of the geometry, and there's a prevalence of metaphysical interest in nested geometries as far as representing kind of abstract principles in their clearest or more direct means. And so there's inevitable likenesses out there. And that's kind of the point, is that when you're working with these really distilled kind of symbols, you can find them everywhere. And that's something that I really love about it.
Yeah, I didn't know if maybe you thought that question would be a little strange, but it made me think about something that an interview that I had seen it was something that came up in your podcast episode about David Lynch. I had to think of the same thing. The interview where someone asked him, tell me what the spiritual significance of Eraserhead is. And he says, no. And later he goes on and he says, I create something and it means something to me. And I think all artists would agree on this. When someone else looks at it, when I look at it, and then I just, it made me think of Kenneth Anger film, and it made me think of Gustav Klimt. Those are the things that calls up in my mind and in my intuition and my experience. But that's the whole beautiful thing about art. It doesn't have to mean the same thing to each person. It can mean something personal and unique to each person.
Exactly. Yeah.
And of course, you can get into the whole topic of sacred geometry and the perfect forms that you have. Of course, you have the old paintings about squaring the circle, where you see the alchemist is, trying to get the triangle and the circle to fit inside the square. These are very deep symbols and old symbols that I think engage people, even if you don't have any particular training or background in a particular esoteric area. It's still kind of unconsciously, perhaps, calling something up within you, like, oh yeah, I identify with that in some way. So
absolutely.
I didn't know if that would resonate with you, but it does resonate with me, that I find myself, whenever I'm looking at art or listening to music, that I'm constantly in this, I don't know, transient state or something, that I'm kind of like, thinking about, oh, it reminds me of this. It makes me think of that. Or I remember seeing that. And it makes me think of all of those things. And it becomes kind of this web of all of these connections. So I don't know if that makes any sense to you. But
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's not only the power of art, but also of the metaphysical language, which is really designed to stir up
exactly.
the kind of subconscious awareness. And, you might have conscious associations, like, oh, that reminds me of my mother when she did this, or that reminds me of this painting, or whatever. But there's all these other subconscious things that get stirred up as well.
Right.
And I think that's something that metaphysics is really uniquely developed throughout human history, and provides us a service in that regard, in much the same way that art does. I see them just so closely connected.
Yeah, good point, and well stated. So, of course, music is a large part of your work, and I noticed that you mentioned the music of the spheres as one of the influential concepts that inspires you. And this made me think of Dr. Randall Hall, who is a professor of music in Illinois, as well as a performing musician. He plays the saxophone, who also mentioned this to me. Are you acquainted with him and his
Not
work?
personally. I listened to your interview with him. I think it was like a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it was last year that I interviewed him.
Yeah.
And it was a very, I guess if you want to talk about serendipity, he used to work with my aunt, Patricia, Dr. Patricia Shea, at the Augustana College. And she's now retired, but he's still going strong. But apparently they had been talking about the podcast, my podcast, and he had shown some interest and reached out to me and said, hey, I'm writing this book about music. And he's going back to, like, the old school, ideas about mystical states, and going back to the
Neoplatonists and
the Platonists and Corpus Hermeticum and, the ancient stuff.
Yeah.
I had the most wonderful discussion with him, but I thought if there would be somebody that you would probably like to talk to, it would probably be him. So I'm just throwing it out there for you.
He was ringing a lot of bells.
Yes. So, if you ever want to interview somebody that, he might be somebody you might want to reach out to.
I'd love to talk with Randall.
Yeah, I think it would be a great conversation. I would be really keen to hear it. Anyway, I'm going to just indulge myself here. I'd like to ask you your opinions about musical modes. And I've never been able to ask anybody about this before because I hadn't had the background and the training for this. But I thought, okay, you've got a PhD in all of this, so you know what I'm going to be asking you about. For the listeners out there, musical modes, there are 7 of them, and they all have their own mood. And some of them are very often used. Some of them are hardly ever used, or at least one of them is hardly ever used, the Locrian. And I was just wondering, which mode do you find to be the most esoteric?
Well, I would view the modes kind of like we do the zodiac, in the sense of from the kind of as above, so below perspective.
Okay, let's get into it.
Just in the sense that the zodiac represents various aspects of our own nature, of our soul. I would say that the modes do that as well. So all modes, and in effect all sounds, have a spiritual agency based on kind of intention and context. But like you said, they each have like a different mood, just like the planetary intelligence have different moods, different characters. But we contain all of those within us. We lean in certain directions or emphasize certain things more than others. But the real beauty of all of this is that it's all interconnected into our very nature. But so I would say to know which mode is maybe the most appropriate for magical use or of something of that nature is something that one learns by becoming familiar with lots of different modes. Because then you start learning where one is needed in the moment or to balance out certain other overemphasis. But that's how I approach it. And I'm one thing I've learned through comparative metaphysics is that some things are consistent, but for the most part, creative variation it reigns. And that's something that will frustrate most people who come to this. But if you want knowns, if you want clear distinctions and categories, science and reason are always there for you. But when it comes to metaphysics, if there's not a nice heaping dose of the irrational, if there's not room to grow, room for possibility, room for interpretation, then you're probably doing it wrong. So I've really come to appreciate more kind of dynamic creative engagements with these correspondence systems and so forth. And just really kind of, like I said earlier, following your inspiration, because where the inspiration is aroused in the mode, in the color, or whatever you're working with, that's where you're going to have the most effectiveness in materializing your intentions in that magical perspective, so to speak. Does that answer your question, or did I?
I like that answer. Yeah. I had, when I was studying religion and esotericism years ago, I got into this idea of looking at musical modes when we were studying Judaism. And the Jewish have the liturgy.
Lovely word.
So you have, of course, your textual liturgy, but you also have songs that are also being sung. And I was looking at the Jewish mode of music, the musical mode is the Phrygian dominant. And I thought, well, that's interesting because Phrygian dominant is also quite often used, not only in flamenco or in other Middle Eastern music, also Asian music, but also contemporary heavy metal and, the devil's music. So I thought this was a nice, very, kind of funny juxtaposition that you have this, sacred music, and then you have this, what you would call, I guess, profane music, but they're still using the same modes.
Totally.
And it still has, for some people, it can be like, well, those are two completely different things, but they're connected in this way because they're using the same mode. Anyway, that's just my nerdy brain, I guess.
I don't mean to sound dismissive. I mean, the traditions out there have very clear kind of opinions on these kinds of things. Like Plato had very clear opinions on the meaning of the modes and prioritizing certain ones over other ones. We also see in like Indian raga, they have the rasas, the different moods that are applied to the modes, and they schedule modes for every hour of the day. That's a really rich application of what you're talking about in Indian tradition. But yeah, my own perspective is coming from a more kind of pagan folk DIY perspective that I will always favor that. My scholarship, when I approach the research, I approach it very scholarly. But as far as what I'm kind of drawn to or where I find meaning in a lot of these traditions is really in the creative engagement.
Yeah, I understand. This was just something that I only scratched the surface of, and I do understand that there's a much deeper and richer traditions of themselves, different belief systems that use music as well, very important part of their whole tradition. So yeah, I only got into a little teeny tiny portion of that, little tip of the iceberg, so to speak. But I really thought it was a really fun thing. And yeah, I could kind of nerd out that way. And I also found out that the theme of Jaws is also Phrygian dominant. So just like, handy little things that you can talk about at a cocktail party or something. So anyway, I'd like to also ask you about the secret sound. You mentioned this before. I'd like to get into this a little bit more now. I listened to episode 29 about David Lynch, of course. We just lost a
Rest in peace,
great man there. You called that one the magic rustling. I really loved listening to that. I love the soundscapes of your podcasts.
Thank you. I had a special sonic fun with
one.
that particular episode.
Number 33 about Eva Augusta Vesalius, called the godmother of music therapy. These, of course, are all available for subscribers. It was just like a warm blanket around me when I was listening to these. I just thought this was the best thing ever. I was like, I thought, why haven't I found this sooner? Anyway, for the listeners, each episode focuses on one artist and explores the esoteric or spiritual influences of that artist. And you have over 40 episodes. I think it's 44 that you have.
I think 43.
Okay,
yeah.
43. I'm curious to know, how did you go about finding these artists and researching their backgrounds?
Well, thank you for your kind comments. Early on, I was kind of, after doing the work on Arthur Russell, I was just kind of targeting composers that I was inspired by, like William Grant Still or Henry Cowell, people who are a little bit more well-known, but have these hugely rich metaphysical biographies and backgrounds that rarely get any kind of light shown on them. And so that was kind of a focus for a while. And then the more I dug, the more people I found. Sometimes the archives would lead me in a direction. Sometimes I would interview family members and get kind of a motive path going that way. There's still 2 episodes, I think, that are not done because I was waiting on a certain archival thing. Like, I don't want to put things together unless they're as comprehensive as I know they can be. So that's been a big part of it. But, it's like, I think David Lynch and Louise Landis-Levy were the only 2 people who were living at the time I made an episode about them. And those were just personal indulgences. I wanted to spend time in their world and share that with people. But for the most part, it's really kind of digging through the dustbins of history. And usually when I get like a hunch about somebody and I get really excited, and then when I go looking for something about them and I can't find anything, then I get really excited because then I can go digging, and I always find something when I go digging. So that's been just a huge pleasure researching the Arthur Russell Buddhist bubblegum dissertation. That's where I found my love for archival work and kind of started collecting pretty heavily during the pandemic. And that's guided a lot of what I've done, just the way things kind of serendipitously accrue. I do not pursue things. There are certain things I keep tabs on, but for the most part, it's constant looking and constant discovery. And that's kind of what drives the machine, keeps the engine going for me.